5.5 months after police shot and killed Breonna Taylor during a no-knock warrant at her home, her family is still pleading for criminal charges against the officers who killed her. But we are learning how prosecutors in Louisville included Breonna's name in her ex-boyfriend's plea deal this summer. The attorney for Jamarcus Glover, her ex, says his client was offered a deal if he was willing to implicate her in a, quote, organized crime syndicate. NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos joins me now. Danny, all right, this is a lot to break down, so walk us through this. The lawyer also said implicating Breonna was part of the initial plea deal, but her name wasn't part of later drafts. Can you explain how this all works and why they might want Breonna Taylor on the list after she had been killed by police?
If true, this is a tactic that prosecutors will sometimes use to avoid civil liability on the lawsuit side later. So, for example, if they think they have a situation where someone was wrongfully arrested, prosecuted, or even killed by police, they will do anything they can to get something on the record from a defendant or some witness like this to say that, oh, there is some evidence of criminality, because any evidence of criminality gets police one step closer to potential immunity from a civil lawsuit. And that is something that happens fairly often, having defendants plead to a lesser charge when the prosecution probably shouldn't have brought the case in the first place.
Now, Danny, how common is it for a plea deal to have a condition like this, and what sort of pressure does it put on a defendant?
Sometimes plea deals do include a cooperation agreement. In other words, the defendant is agreeing to snitch on his friends or co-conspirators or whatever the case may be. Prosecutors will say they have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, but there are often conditions on plea deals. This is slightly unusual because you're not usually implicating someone who is already dead, because dead people cannot be prosecuted. In this case, if that's what police are doing, if that's what prosecutors are doing, it seems like it would be pretty obviously to avoid the civil liability by painting Taylor as involved in some criminality and getting someone on the record saying that she was.
Now, let's talk about Kenneth Walkers' civil case. He's suing the city and their police department over his arrest the night Breonna Taylor was shot and killed by police. Tell us about that.
It's really an interesting case because it's a traditional assault and battery case on the one hand, even though he wasn't as grievously wounded, mortally wounded like his girlfriend. Kenneth Walker was the subject of that knock and announce warrant. He says there was no announcement. But it's also very interesting because he's bringing what's called declaratory judgment. He's asking the court to say, look, Kenneth Walker was covered by stand your ground. And that means that he's immune from prosecution. Even though the prosecutor has dismissed the case for now, he's dismissed it without prejudice. That means that they could bring it again, theoretically, if the investigation turns up some evidence of criminality. Kenneth Walker is not only looking for money, but he's also looking for a court to say that unequivocally he has immunity from prosecution because of Kentucky's stand your ground law.
Now, we actually got a chance to hear from him yesterday. Let's take a listen.
All of a sudden, someone started beating on the door. They refused to answer when we yelled, "Who is it?" 15 minutes later, Breonna was dead from a hail of police gunfire, and I was in police custody. The police arrested, jailed, and charged me with murder of a police officer. I was raised by a good family. I am a legal gun owner, and I would never knowingly shoot a police officer. Breonna and I did not know who was banging on the door, but the police know what they did.
So, Danny, you just broke this down a little bit for us, but let's talk here about the case he's making and how likely he is to win.
You heard Kenneth Walker saying the police know what they did. I mean, key in his civil case, he has to demonstrate, I see him freezing a little, he has to demonstrate that the police knew they were doing something wrong. Not just that they made a mistake, because if they made it in good faith and it was an accident, then they can escape liability. He has to show that they did something deliberate and that it was they knew it was wrong when they did it. It's a very, very high bar to hold police responsible, much higher than just holding members of the public responsible when they do something wrong and injure somebody. So that is clearly the mission here, and you can hear it in Kenneth Walker's statement here. He knows, I'm sure, that he has a high bar to clear, and he and his lawyers are going to try and make it.
Now, Kentucky's Attorney General Daniel Cameron is overseeing the Breonna Taylor case, and he spoke about it this weekend. Let's now listen to that.
we are looking under every stone, leaving no stone unturned as it relates to this investigation. Again, a thorough and fair investigation is what is deserved by all. We also have the strength of relationships with the FBI to receive this ballistics report and information that can be critical to our analysis.
So what exactly could that ballistics report reveal?
The ballistics are key in this case. Walker's team has indicated that his bullet, the one he fired, doesn't have any evidence of blood on it. Now, that's pretty important because if the police are alleging that Sergeant Mattingly was actually hit by Walker's bullet, that strengthens their case for use of deadly force. But be advised, police don't have to get hit with a bullet in order to be able to use deadly force. If in a case where a defendant is shooting into the air, that could possibly create a reasonable fear of deadly force by the police, warranting their own deadly force. But if it's the case, if it comes out that the police were wrong about the bullet striking Sergeant Mattingly, if it turns out the police may have even shot Sergeant Mattingly accidentally in a friendly fire situation, then both legally and terms of public image of this case, it will not look good for the police.
All right, Danny, thank you for breaking that down. Complicated there, and thank you for helping us out.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.